Hi everybody, it's Bill Smith back to visit with you again for another module of IS 325, The Contemporary Muslim World. Tonight I'm speaking with you about Islam in the West, and in the second part of this module, Islam and the West. The difference in these conversations is one is about the movement and exchange of peoples, and the other is about the movement and exchange of ideas. So tonight we'll really be focusing on that exchange of peoples as opposed to ideas, and when you continue on with the second part of this, you'll get more about what it means to have those ideas going back and forth. You'll see I put a little tag onto the title here, Islam in the West, that it's in the East too, because there are further eastern regions of the globe where Muslim communities are also present. Now, those of you who may remember an earlier conversation that I had with you when I was defining the region may correctly point out that I said that this class would focus pretty much exclusively on the communities and countries that self-identified as Muslim, and we would kind of exclude other parts of the world where there may be Muslim communities, but the class would focus on the OIC and its member states. However, one of the founding principles of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and from the Charter is this that's written here on the right, that they would pay attention to Muslim communities abroad and be concerned with the treatment or maltreatment of people of their common faith, and if things happened abroad, that they would issue statements, try and leverage pressure, and just basically work to the betterment of Muslim communities around the world. So this image on the left-hand side is just a cover sheet from a series of resolutions that were issued by a combined meeting of the foreign ministers of the 57 OIC member states. So a foreign minister would be equivalent to our Secretary of State, who formally represents the executive in external dealings. So the Council of Foreign Ministers then issued a series of resolutions where they promised to take action or make recommendations or do whatever they could to impact and improve situations of Muslim states or Muslim communities abroad. So I know what I said a few times ago, and if you're keeping score, you may say, man, that guy can't be trusted. He just said we wouldn't work on those other countries, but here we are. But that's why. That's because the OIC itself has a component that focuses externally. I want to make sure that as we talk about these things, we understand the difference between migration, emigration, and immigration. So migration is the movement of peoples from one place to another. It doesn't have to be a foreign or international. It could just be, within a country, but it's all of it. So if you pick up and leave and go someplace else, that's migration. The act of leaving the place is emigration, or makes you an emigrant. So you can talk about how many emigrants a country has. That's how many have left. And then also how many immigrants they have and how many have migrated in, how many have arrived, and that's the process of immigration. Make sure you understand the difference between those things when we're talking about numbers of folks going. One of the places you can find interesting data is through the CIA World Factbook, and they talk about emigrants and immigrants, but they also have a net migration category that can confuse people because they might see a net migration number that's zero, and so zero, that seems weird that nobody came and nobody left, but it's a +1 -1 equals 0 scenario. So a high positive rate is a lot of immigrants arriving. A negative rate is a lot of immigrants leaving, and the net migrant rate is the middle of that. And so you can pull that number up and explore. I'm going to put the link here in the module, so if you're curious to see what the different OIC member states look like, you can. When we're talking about Islam in the West, there's a concern on the part of some Europeans that too many Muslims are moving into the states, their countries. We'll talk about what that looks like when we lay out the three sort of patterns of where you get stages of Muslims coming into Europe and elsewhere in the West. So by 2016, which was the year after, 2015 was the year of the biggest, massive wave of Muslim migration into Europe ever. But that still meant that in 2016 it was only about 5% of the population, and that's from highs in Bulgaria and Cyprus of 11% and 25% respectively. And there's a reason for that. That's because there were already Muslim communities there, so when the migration process happened, it augmented those numbers rather than created them out of whole cloth. So if you went back to more of the patterns that existed before the refugee crises that I'll tell you about here in a minute, before the refugee crises and those sorts of movements of peoples, then the figure on the right is what you would look like in 2050. Much larger Muslim populations, in countries of Europe, going from 25 to 26 million now to around 58 million in 2050. But there are lower and higher estimates depending on other push factors or pull factors that may arise. So I really want to focus though on the three phases that gets you this. So on one, for example, that number in Germany would be based on existing populations continuing to grow. And on the other, if you go higher than that, it'll be from other kinds of immigration. So let's start here with this idea that there were already Muslims in the West. There are Muslim regions of Europe, and there's also impact in the Americas. This map is of the European Union where it abuts with Turkey. There's been a long-standing conversation about whether Turkey should become a member of the European Union, and hotly debated back and forth. And some of it's cultural, and some of it has to do with population, and some of it has to do with modes of governance. But the reason it becomes a conversation is because in this map here that you see, there's this line that you probably can't see it very well, but there a little line there between the large body of the eastern part of Turkey and a very small part of the western part of Turkey, which is actually on the European continent. Turkey spans both continents. There's the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. Those are narrow water passageways that go up into the Black Sea, which is up in here. But that means that Turkey is already in the West. That means that Islam is already in the West before large-scale migration starts in the middle of the 20th century. And it also means that because of this region, it isn't like they just sort of stop immediately at the border, but that the sort of migration patterns within that region means that in Bulgaria, which is this state, and Greece, which is this state in this part here, an old Roman region and Byzantine region called East Thrace, there were significant Muslim populations. So there's Turkey's, this says eastern portion, pretend that doesn't say that, it's supposed to be western portion, and then East Thrace. And then, Russia drops down this way and has significant Muslim populations that are sort of around Azerbaijan and Georgia. Chechnya, you may have heard of. That's a Muslim region of Russia where there's a lot of restive populations. But Russia being part of Europe also means there's a larger European population. Iberia, once upon a time, was a largely Muslim peninsula for 600 years until around 1500 when an era called the Reconquista ended, where those communities are sort of pushed out and back into North Africa. But there's both forced migrants and later migration into the Americas. An estimated 10 to 15% of all slaves brought to the United States came from Muslim regions of Africa. And similar things happened in other parts of the Caribbean and of Central and South America, which meant that Islam and Muslims were present for a long time. Now, slaves weren't allowed to practice their religion openly, and so a lot of that was tapped down. But as European colonies bring in labor forces from different parts of the world, you end up with labor migration to the Americas. Not always voluntary labor, but it does mean that that there were Muslim populations in the Americas as well. The second phase, which begins after World War II, has more to do with trends in work opportunities and in sort of decolonization processes or colonization and decolonization, and then guest workers. So let's roll through these really quickly since we're about halfway through this conversation already. It's a good thing I'm not trying to do and the West in this talk as well, because I'm barely going to make it through in. So pre-decolonization, several of the European colonizing states, like the United Kingdom and like France, had certain differing relationships with different of their colonies. And in some of their colonies, people were actually able to become citizens, not of the colony, but of the colonizer. So that would mean that in Algeria and Tunisia, for example, current OIC member states in North Africa, Tunisians and Algerians could become French citizens. And if you're a French citizen, then you can move freely into France, and many people did. The similar thing happened with French possessions in northern South America and in the Caribbean. Guadeloupe, for example, is one of the Caribbean states where you can move to France. Because you have French citizenship. So that's one. And the decolonization era, which started in 1957 and then continues through for about 30 years, means that as the wars happen and people who were displaced, who also may have been friendly towards the French or the British or others in their home countries sometimes had to leave, and so they would typically leave back to the countries, or not back to, but to the countries that had been their colonizers in the first place. So this means that you have significant populations rise in France, in certain cities, in certain neighborhoods, in the UK, in certain cities, in certain neighborhoods. So those populations then exist in the West. The next one would be Gastarbeiter, or guest worker programs, where Germany, as it began to industrialize and have lots of opportunities for work, but for cheap labor, didn't have a ready supply of cheap labor. One of the peculiar things that happens in Germany is when the line is drawn very firmly between East Germany and West Germany, the East Germans can't come into the West to get the jobs that are attractive to them. So they sign deals with external foreign ministries and try and bring people in on short-term visas to work for 2 years or for 3 years, and then to take the money and their skills and go back home. And so one of the most significant of these was signed with Turkey, between West Germany, then West Germany, and Turkey, bringing Turkish workers in. So that's this image here on the top. So the Gastarbeiter alone came for about 15 years, rotating in and out. Now, not all of them left. But most of the time they did leave and go back home, but some stayed. In the early 1970s, mid-1970s, especially with the oil shock that happened, I think Professor Afat Chow is going to have a lecture about oil and the OIC. The economy collapses in West Germany. They decide they have to cancel the agreement to bring in more guest workers. What they did instead was do family reunification programs for the guest workers who are already there. And actually that leads to a larger increase in the Muslim population in Germany and other states who practice it, because as you bring in families and then they begin to grow, living in Germany, then those populations also expand. Peculiar rules about citizenship that are different than what we're used to mean that many of them don't become citizens the way the pre-decolonization and decolonization folks did, and leads to some interesting situations. We're used to citizenship by blood. That's actually uncommon around the world. But there you have it. So it does lead to interesting things where identity changes, like who is French, who is German, who are part and parcel of other places. This is a picture of the French World Cup team in 1998 raising the World Cup trophy with people who've come from those colonies. And one of whom was Zinedine Zidane right there, who's Muslim, holding onto the trophy. And his picture is broadcast under the Arc de Triomphe, a very French symbol in Paris, and it's an interesting moment. There's a few others as well. This picture on the bottom is of Carlos Menem, who comes from an Alawite Muslim family from Syria, who immigrated in one of those wider trends of work opportunities patterns from Syria to Argentina. Family's Muslim, he gets into politics, and as he rose to the political ranks, he converted from Islam to Catholicism and then became president of the country, but still sort of claimed there as Muslim by people outside the world, outside the country. But he is Catholic today. So the third big phase is the ongoing refugee crisis of the 21st century. We've had a wave of these from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Libya. And so as refugees flood into Europe from these countries, it really makes existing patterns and arcs and places change as people look for opportunities to gain asylum. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief reading about the difference between asylum and refugees. But in 2015 alone, 1.3 million Syrians applied for asylum in Europe. It changes the shape of Muslim immigration into Europe, and is the main cause driving those sort of difference between low, medium, and high estimates of how many Muslims will be in Europe by 2050. If this kind of pattern, like coming in the Syrian civil war, continues, then that'll be a high number. In the East, there's a concern and opportunity, concern in China with the Uyghurs, in Myanmar with the Rohingya, in India with their Muslims, hope with the Philippines, where they're looking to give autonomy to Muslim regions of Catholic Philippines. But in the others, they're questioning the loyalty and appropriateness of having Muslim populations in the East. I really gave that short shrift, and I apologize for that. I'll make sure you have a reading about the Uyghurs or about India. And in final thoughts, it's an irregular path outside the OIC. What you're looking for are places where the The OIC's external community of Muslims exists in the West and in the East as they strive to make life better for Muslim minority populations